Hello, I'm Joseph White. I am an instructor in Catechetical Ministry at Holy Apostles College and Seminary, and also the Director for Catechetical Resources for OSV Publishing. And I'm speaking today with Father John Yake, who is a priest in Canada who has extensive experience with education at all levels and also works in parish ministry. Father John, tell us a little bit more about your background and the extensive ministry work that you've done and the writing that you've done.
Well, I began my career as a teacher, an elementary school teacher, and then I moved from there to religious life, and I ended up back in teaching. I think it was because I was a vocation director, and I was also associated with chaplaincy at the University of Ottawa, and I was doing the spiritual direction for English speakers, and I began to realize that what the issues they were bringing forward were unresolved issues from their high school careers. That they're coming out of adolescence, there was a lot of confusion. And so it got me thinking about, wouldn't it be nice to be at the in the high school working with adolescents to sort of head this off? Because the best place, like they had left, so it was pretty hard to go back there physically. You can't do that. So it just got me interested in that. So I moved in that direction, got permission to explore it, and I ended up spending the next 28 years in high school teaching. I taught history and theology and philosophy, and then I was also the campus minister. So I had to produce a program for each of the grades. I discovered that each grade in high school is psychosocially different. And that led me to write this book, the Talking to Teens About the Mass, because their issues are different for each year. And like some people think adolescence is just one period, some say it's 3, but I found they're quite different at each time. But anyway, so I spent my time there, and then because chaplaincy was non-existent, like there was no, the people who were doing what they called chaplaincy, I called it force-feeding young people what they had already rejected on Sunday. So I looked into going back to the university to explore this area of faith formation for adolescents, because I couldn't find it anywhere within the school system. Although to the credit of lay people, they started chaplaincy. It wasn't started by clergy or the church, it was started by lay people. But anyway, so I got a master's in theological reflection at the major level, and then the director of that program said, what I'm looking for doesn't exist because nobody knows what chaplaincy is. She says, you have to do a doctorate for that. So that's what I did. I got a doctorate of ministry after that. And so I've figured out through my experience plus my research how adolescents are evangelized. And I used as the instrument to measure that, I used James Fowler's Faith Development Research Instrument.
Sure.
It was accepted right away by the university that it's kosher. So anyway, I subsequently put my my doctoral research into this book, which is the text for a course I teach at the university, the Ministry of the Evangelization of Adolescents. Because it's a science book, and Mellen Press, they publish science books. So, and then I've written, my first book actually was this book on Star Wars, because back in 1985, because I noticed teenagers were really quite into it. When I was living in California, I went to a matinee of Star Wars, and I saw right away it was Life of Christ. And the people I was watching with, they didn't see that. So I wrote a book showing that it's the whole thing is, well, it's this Northrop Frye's idea that the Bible is, he called in one of his books, The Great Code, the Bible and literature. So that got me interested in communicating, using the story of the day to relate the Christian message. And then since I've written this book, Teens Making Decisions, and that's Bernard Lonergan's general empirical method there.
Sure, yeah.
And because I taught him into my grade 12 philosophy, I taught Lonergan, they're fascinated with him and so forth, because I think he addresses the relativism of our time. And because he maintains that if you don't know something for yourself, you don't know anything. So that's so anyway, when I retired from high school teaching, I was invited by the rector of St. Augustine Seminary to start the Propaedeutic year, the spiritual year. So I did that, and I facilitated for 6 years. Then I retired again. That was my second retirement, and now I'm in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, where I'm pastor of some parishes.
Wonderful.
I still teach online at the seminary.
Wow. You're doing a lot in your second retirement too, it sounds like, Father. I was curious about what you said about force feeding young people what they've rejected on Sunday. And you know, in recent years, certainly in the United States, and I imagine in many other places as well, there's been a great deal of focus on the tragedy of large numbers of young people leaving the church. And I'm just curious, based on your own research and your experience in ministry, why do you think this is happening, and what can we do about it?
That's a huge question. Huge question. Well, first of all, it's true. What you've said is true, and the research has shown it. I know you've heard of Reginald Bibby. He's a religious sociologist, and he's documented, at least in Canada, in a book called The Emerging Generation. He's documented the major exodus of young people. He also showed that the same percentage of young people who've left the church is the same as adults. That we need to point out that they're different, because adolescents, as much as they think that they're thinking for themselves, they really mirror the culture. They're uncritical thinkers. They just take, this is part of what Fowler maintained in their faith stage, synthetic conventional. They're very conventional. We think of teenagers as rebels, but they're actually quite conventional. But unfortunately, what is conventional today is not to be religious. So to answer that question, it is huge, but if you want me to ramble for a while, I can.
Well, no, go ahead. It looked like you're...
The first thing is, well, first I wanted to assent to your statement. It's not an assumption, it's a scientific fact. The second chapter of my book is the cultural context for youth ministry. And it's the longest chapter. And I thought I was being quite negative, but since I've written it, that's 2005, my current students say I didn't go far enough. In other words, things are getting worse very quickly. But anyway, the cultural master story today is decidedly opposed to God, to theism, to faith. It's all about self-centeredness, a search for, if you're into religion, you want to search for an easy one, something without sacrifice or priesthood. Joe Holland wrote a book on social analysis, said there's an irreversible crisis in the West. So if we look at the elements of culture, that's media, education, and government. And from the perspective of young people, all three of them lack a foundational and universally accepted principle to guide a unified vision. It's relativism. This is what Pope Benedict in his inaugural sermon as Pope said this is what he would be confronting. What all three have in common is atheism. So if we look at the media, it's basically the left agenda. And what G.K. Chesterton called the thin and theoretic minorities, which means the media are telling us, they're not reporting the news, they're telling us what it should be. And I just recently, I noticed, this is in the United States, the Cheryl Atkinson, she has said that that media is all biased. And you can get her lectures where she's saying it. And then Carrie Lake, she was the news anchor for Fox 10 News. She resigned right on television and told them the same thing, that she doesn't feel like she's a journalist anymore. So the media is no longer to be trusted in terms of reporting. They have an agenda, And but it's unfortunate, that our people are not really media savvy. I think they're, in my experience here, they really believe what's being told to them. But for young people, it must be quite the little nightmare. And then connect that with technology, how our young people are onto technology 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
And there's reasons for that. One would be perhaps they're what they're called latchkey kids. They come home to an empty house and they're afraid. Since daycare, they've been afraid. And so they keep connected to their friends, what they call friends, 24/7. And then the other thing is education, which is, I think, in my experience, it's really lost its mandate. I don't think it knows what it's doing. So it seems to attend to cultural fads and ideologies. Poet Robert Bly, he said that it's in his book, Sibling Society, he said that school is boring, terribly boring. And there's reasons in philosophy for that too.
Mm-hmm.
But in education, for example, they're still teaching Darwin. And there's no proof for there's no fossil proof for his theory of evolution. And yet it's taught as if it's a fact. And even if it is true, it doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't mean anything. Then there's Freud and Marx, all atheists, their theories are falsehoods. But this is what our students are being taught, stuff that's not really true. So, and we have to go back that their religion is not central, that God is excluded from these thinkers. And I taught in a Catholic school, and it was unbelievable that teachers were teaching what they thought the church should be teaching. And that's why I look like this. I had to fight with them that, no, you're not, you're hired to teach what the Catholic Church teaches, and for your own integrity. But that was quite a tragic scenario for me. And the third, of course, is government. And actually, I might say something more about education, because some of these thinkers, like Paulo Freire, for example, he shows that education has to problematize the realities, that students have to be engaged. And in philosophy, say Gadamer and Heidegger, these guys, they talk about how in reading, the whole world comes into being. There's an ontological need of students to engage a world. And they're given sort of propositional thinking. They're giving literal like you just memorize what we tell you, and that's it. So that's where the boredom, I think, comes from.
Yeah,
is they're not being enlisted as agents of history, that we should be teaching this way. Here's the best thing on this topic at the moment, but I invite any of you who are interested to engage yourselves in this and try to push the boundaries and understand it more. Then it'd be more exciting, I think, for them, that
right.
we're giving them, I think Lonergan called it an anti-historical immobilism, that the world is just static and this is it. It doesn't need to be improved and just fit in. And Ivan Illich, he wrote a book called Deschooling Society, in which he said that school is just a reproductive organ of the culture. And that's not terribly exciting. Anyway, the other thing is government, and I don't think that requires any comment. I mean, just turn on the television in your country and mine. But this is the world that our young people, if you don't have a foundation, see, the only religion can support a tradition that can succeed to be the glue to hold society together and offer a sense of purpose and meaning. But we've lost that. In a world of relativism, young people have no compass. They don't know where they're at. And, I used to have one of the programs in my high school was a support group program. We do with children from separated and divorced families, bereavement, drug abuse. I had a senior and junior drug abuse support groups. But the one that drew the most people, as a matter of fact, it drew so many of the population, I couldn't meet their needs, because a support group shouldn't have more than maybe 10 people. And you have to have a facilitator in there, and I couldn't be everywhere. So it was the stress. It was that if you're dealing with stress. So our young people, the image I've heard is they're like ducks on a pond. It's tranquil on the surface, but underneath they're paddling frantically. And now with this COVID-19, they're talking about stressed out young people. And I'm thinking they're stressed out to begin with. And they go to school to socialize.
Mm-hmm.
And if you cut off the social dimension of their schooling, you've really done harm to them. So they are suffering. Well, when they say suicide is the #1 killer of adolescents, it's a failure of our culture. There's no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it sounds like our culture has failed them in many different ways. I also heard in what you were saying there that lack of education and critical thinking, that young people are educated simply to just absorb whatever's being communicated without any critical thinking about it. And we expect developmentally, and you mentioned the work of Fowler there, that they're not going to be as adept at that, certainly as young people, but how do they reach that next level of being able to filter things through a critical lens if we don't work with them on it, right? You've spoken about the importance of evidence-based practices when it comes to youth ministry and work with youth, really becoming educated in what works with young people and doing things that we know are effective. Why is this important versus just just kind of doing whatever is in our hearts or whatever intuitively we feel like we should do? Why is it important to look at evidence-based practice, and where can people turn to learn more about what works with young people, what's been tried and shown effective?
Okay, that's another huge question. After my book was published, I was invited to give the workshops to all of the youth ministers of the Archdiocese of Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
The first question I asked them is, how would they evaluate their success? In other words, what are you doing? What is it? And nobody could answer the question. So I said, this is a pseudo-professional role. And if you don't have a destination, how do you know how you're going to get there? But now, to preface any remarks I would make on this question, and this was my question, this is why I have been a researcher as well as a practitioner. In my book, I mentioned something that's usually unmentionable in Catholic circles, and that's the demonic. That we've denied, or we're embarrassed by this, and I think it's huge. It was huge in Jesus' ministry, and St. Paul said, we're up against principalities and powers, so we have to be able to recognize there is a good and an evil. This is one of the things where our young people are being cheated at school, that the left denies evil. It's just whatever you want. It's sort of psychologized everything. And if good and evil don't exist, then what is the point of anything? And this, I think, leads to suicide when there's no point to your life and there's no goals. But with the Catholic teaching, the goal is obvious. It's to get to heaven. That the whole nature is to get to the supernatural, the earth to heaven. And this is clear in the incarnation of Jesus and in the whole Mariology. But the other thing is, what I do in my book is, rather than people take my word for it, I have to sort of prove my assumptions, which are really not assumptions. But anyway, I traced the trend to contemporary secularization that's had an evolution of about 400 years, arguably from Descartes, 1650 is when he died. Yeah. So what we've inherited today has been festering for at least 400 years. So we have to realize it didn't start yesterday. It didn't start with anything in our present, actually. So what are the elements of the Cartesian deconstructionism? Well, he attacked to the tradition. In his cogito, I think, therefore I am. So anything else that is not me doesn't exist. So it was the rise of not science, but scientism. Like, science is a good thing, but scientism rejects divinity because you can't prove it. So our young people are going to school studying the arts and sciences. In other words, mystery is out. You can't prove it. So their whole formation is geared towards a denial of God. And in that, once that happens, there's a depersonalization and a repression of the subject. Lonergan does a marvelous thinking on this, seeing it from a philosophical thing. He shows how the neglected subject and alienated, how far we are from our humanity is really quite tragic. And it's done by the use of language. That's a political correctness, to disconnect persons from a common sense and a tradition. And this is aided and abetted by technology. But Cartesian subjectivity, the world is significant only by way of the subject. Like, we give it meaning, and that's what relativism's the foundation. We give it has no meaning of its own. Like with Christianity, it has the meaning that God gave it. But once you throw God out, it becomes, in the third wave of modernity, Nietzsche said God is dead, and he was probably right. God is dead as far as people are thinking. And then there's godlessness, that John Courtney Murray's book, the Problem of God, where he shows the different dimensions of modernity and godlessness. And one is the godlessness of the academy, where we're searching for truth, but we on purpose don't find it. So education is ideally to be constantly improving things. So I think that's why I think in my book I put so much emphasis on the culture, because to answer this question of the importance of evidence-based practices, Frary said, it's education for is always education against. So you have to know what it is who is opposing you, because education doesn't happen in a vacuum. And the more concretely you understand your students and what's happening to them, then you won't get so discouraged when you realize you can't evangelize them, because the little bit of time, they don't go to church anymore, so the little bit of time you have, it's pretty hard to oppose the whole cultural elements, education, government, media, which is nonstop. So my research in youth ministry has discovered the science of the psychology of youth ministry. And so when you use the word evidence, it's not about popularity. In my introduction, I show what we are doing in the church with youth ministry, but why it's not working. And interestingly, a publisher who had an interest in my book before Sheed & Ward was Sheed & Ward rather than Mellen Press. And the two guys I talked to in Chicago said they were interested because I only had written the introduction, in which I delineated the things that don't work. And they said, we're amused because that's exactly what we are doing. We're saying it doesn't work. But one of them, when you say the word evidence, I cover that on page 7. It's called baiting the hook. And this is where we try to attract young people with stuff that they'll like, whether it's sports or parties or stuff that's sort of socializing things. But then the problem is we're always afraid to bring in the real agenda. I remember talking to a grade 9 student, and she said, I joined the parish youth group, try to find God, and they keep leading me to activities that don't get me there. We never get there. So this is not fair to teenagers, to see them as really not interested in religion, because they are very religious. They're very spiritual, extremely spiritual. So by evidence, what I mean is to deliver a youth ministry program that's congruent with the nature of adolescence. So that's what I discovered. Basically, that's what my book builds up to prove my theory, which I called youth ministry theory, which is certainly evidence-based, but it's also scientific. If you facilitate your program, youth ministry, using my 5 principles, you will succeed. And my students are basically teachers who are in chaplaincy in high schools, or they're in youth ministry in their parishes. And constantly I hear, now I see what I'm doing wrong. Now I'm changing everything. So this is why I keep at it, because it seems to be, if I can influence one youth leader, youth minister, I can influence a lot of young people. So there's my 5 principles. And do you want me to talk about those?
Yeah, please do. I was going to say, this is making me think of the emphasis in the new directory for catechesis that came out last year in 2020, the new universal catechetical directory that we have. speaks to the importance of an understanding of the human sciences, education, psychology, sociology, not to psychologize everything as you referred to before, but to contributing to our methodology so that we're actually basing what we do for young people, for example, on what we know about young people and how they grow and how they think. And it sounds like a good part of your work has been devoted to that. So I'm sure that our listeners now want to hear those 5 principles and understand that a little better.
Okay. Well, the 5 principles come out of James Fowler's Aspects of Faith Development Theory.
Mm-hmm.
So there are 7 of them. But Romney Moseley, who is a co-author of the research instrument, and he also wrote a book called Becoming Ourselves Before God, Becoming a Self Before God. He told me I couldn't check, like I tested my theory in my doctoral work with a core retreat, right? A Christ and Others retreat. Mm-hmm. One of those 3-day serendipitous, very intense weekends. They're encounter weekends, like there's challenge, there's engage encounter, marriage encounter. I did an encounter with Lyman Coleman in Los Angeles. It was called frog kissing in those days. And there were 10,000 of us in the room, and we all left as brothers and sisters. It's an interesting dynamic. But he discovered the dynamic on his way to try to get a good relationship with his father that had become estranged. So that's what this is. But I thought, and people were being changed by it. I was also in the challenge retreat movement when I was in Ottawa. And parents would say, what did you do to my son, or what did you do to my daughter? They're different, they're changed, they're improved. And we couldn't answer that question. And I said, God's a mystery, but ministry shouldn't have to be. When you go under the knife in the operating theater, you hope that the person there knows what they're doing. They're not just exploring and hoping for an outcome. They know what it is. So Fowler gave us science about it. And I talk about him and his experience in chapter 1. So they already know who he is and so forth. So Moseley showed me I could test 5 of the aspects of faith development theory. So they are bounds of social awareness, social perspective taking, locus of authority, form of world coherence, and symbolic function. So to translate that into regular language, social perspective taking is looking at relationships, that young people are into friendships. They're really into relationships. So like some of the textbooks and so forth for teenagers are from an adult perspective. Mm-hmm. And they're avoided. These are the areas to address if you want to evangelize young people. Don't make assumptions about where you think they are. Do this. So bounds of social awareness means belonging to community. They're desperate to belong to community. Erik Erikson said that they create this fad of distancing themselves from adults because adults are in the way of their emergence into adulthood. Mm-hmm. Locus of authority means making decisions. What is your philosophy of life? How do you go about making decisions? Because they're in the point, they're left childhood, and they know they're going to be thrust into the real world. So where you have to decide where they're going to go. Are they going to study? Are they going to work? What are they going to do? And also vocational choices as well, because we go through a life crisis every 18 to 30 years. This is a synthesis of psychological theory. The first one is 18 and 3rd. It's out of high school, and you resolve this issue by resolving 2 issues: the issue of career. What am I going to do? What's my job or profession? What am I going to do in the workaday world? And school helps you sort that out. And the second one is the sexuality. Am I going to be married? Am I going to be single? How am I going to share my inner life? Because everybody needs intimacy, to put our place inside ourselves. Who am I going to be inside, and who is going to be in me? And then 18, 30 years later is the midlife crisis, and that's very quickly you're not young anymore, and people are dying around you. So the death brings it on. It's the death, not only biological death, but death of your youth. So it's an evaluative time. So you decide, did I pass or fail? Mm-hmm. So if you failed, I intended to become the head of my country, and I didn't. I'm the janitor on I'm sweeping the steps. Well, you can go back maybe and try something else. This is where people get divorced or so forth because they made a mistake somewhere. And then there's ones who evaluate that they passed. So that's a worse crisis, because if you achieve what you set out to achieve, you can die. There's nothing left for you. This is where I was. So I reinvented myself by going back to school. So then the next one, of course, is the obsolescence, but about the age of 55 or so. And this is where people start developing cancers, and because you're being pushed out for people with younger skills, and you're at the end of your career, so people look for reasons to get out. And then the last one is 72-ish, and that's what is my legacy? What did my life mean, and so forth. So this whole trajectory, I used to teach my teenagers this theory, because teenagers tend to be into the immediate. They don't realize that your drug taking now, you don't die today, but it's going to affect you later. And so see the whole of your life. Form world coherence is, what is my philosophy of life? And then symbolic function are treasures of my heart. What is it that you really value? Like you're wearing this particular necklace or something, and that's because your grandmother gave it to you. So it has what they call sentimental value, but that's symbolic function. So that's the first principle, is to engage adolescents in effective evangelizing issues, and those are the 5 issues. The second one is employ youth-appropriate evangelizing structures. So how are young people already structured to be? Like I've been asked over the years, can I help the parish start a youth group? And I said, that's not the question. They're already grouped. Your challenge is, how do you engage that? Because it's already there. If you try to form it, it's going to collapse. And that's what happens with youth groups. They collapse for parish-based stuff. So it's stuff like friendship and informal group settings and so forth. But I talk about this more and more in my book. Third is call forth those who are gifted evangelizers. So even St. Paul will delineate the gifts that are in the church, and it's a charismatic church. This is we're gifted. So but I say call forth. I've discovered that youth ministry is not the job of the pastor; it's the job of the community. But the pastor's role is to discern the gifts to be in youth ministry, and I'm pretty Catholic about that, pretty easy about that, except to point out what I've seen in my experience is look for evangelizing personalities who are positive, who have a sense of humor, who can work with people and not get immediate results, and who are committed, versus ideological thinkers who basically pass on as Christianity their particular hobby horse. And because young people can be used. They can be used for an adult agenda, and they're not even, I mean, it's hard to sort them out because what they're doing looks Christian, but it really isn't. The next one is use evangelizing program styles. So essentially this is dialogue, that I never did anything with young people without them in dialogue with me about it, that they were co-facilitators of their own ministry. I didn't do ministry to them. Like when I preached in, say, school masses or grade masses, I had liturgy committees. We discussed the readings. What's the Lord telling us? How would this be received by your age group? And one that comes to mind, this is a grade 10 group. They said, there's a silence when I asked that question. And then one brave soul said, Father, we don't believe this stuff. We don't believe it. So then I said, let's go back to the gospel. The gospel started out, Jesus was in a house of unbelievers. He's not afraid of your unbelief. So get with it. So we proceeded, and it worked out beautifully. That particular group wrote not only music, but lyrics. And they made plays to illustrate the gospel and how their peers are not taking to it. It was unbelievable. So anyway, then that's basically, each one of these I discuss at length in the book. And then the last one is maintain the spirit of evangelization. So Erik Erikson tells us that the psychological need of adolescence is acceptance. So that's the thing. They have to be loved. There's no baggage that adults are putting on them. So anyway, that's my course in the Ministry of Evangelization of Adolescents is in 4 modules. The first one is a theology of ministry. Do you know what you're doing? Mm-hmm. If you're evangelizing, then evangelize. And then the next one is cultural analysis. And then the psychology of adolescence, which I use the synthetic conventional stage of Fowler as because you discuss that, and it's pretty clear, although there is an adult version of that. Some people never get out of that synthetic conventional. And then there's my theory, youth ministry theory, which I just spoke about. So now to get to your question about what you said, fidelity to God and fidelity to humanity, and using the sciences for youth ministry. Mm-hmm. Well, I would start off with Athanasius, St. Athanasius. The glory of God is man fully alive. The life of man is the vision of God. So I don't see a dichotomy between justice owed to divinity or to humanity. Mm-hmm. All those thinkers I talked about earlier, Marx and Darwin and Freud, it was all an attack on the incarnation. That's what it always is. Because if they can disprove the resurrection, as St. Paul says, if Christ be not risen, we're still in our sins. Mm-hmm. So that's what it comes down to. So there's no apparent split, because the paradox of Jesus Christ, true God and true man, heals it. Mm-hmm. So the human sciences are fine, and we need to use them because, as Fowler showed with his 5 aspects of faith development theory, we're psychologically built. All he's done is show he's using the human dimensions, because these are like compartments where we hold meaning. Like he calls us meaning makers. He wasn't into evangelization with his theory. So partway through my doctoral work, I used him because he shows us the compartments, how we hold meaning. Mm-hmm. But your meaning could be golfing every week, or could be anything. It doesn't have to be your religion, your faith. So I had to drop him and move to a theological understanding of the retreat. But it primarily began with understanding, using the social sciences, because we're human beings and we can understand. Well, I gave a talk, a lecture on this stuff when I was still a doctoral student at Queen's University to second-year theology students, and I was accused of manipulating young people. And I said, well, I never thought of that. Is it manipulation because I understand my subjects, who I'm talking, and I'm going to deliver the best product? Don't salespeople know the people if they're advertising, don't they know who their clients are? But I thought it's interesting. I don't see it as manipulation. I see it as packaging, to use a commercial metaphor, packaging the gospel so it can be received appropriately, because it's congruent with the psychosocial realities of adolescence. Yeah. And an example I would use, you can always butt in, but an example I would use is, I think if we don't bring God into this, we actually jeopardize the fullness of our humanity. And that's where I think the left is missing the boat. Yeah. And for an example of a book I would use is Poverty of Spirit by Johann Metz, because he focuses on that book on the humanity of Jesus. And he shows how human Jesus is as an example of how divine he is. Mm-hmm. That they're actually the same thing. That Jesus came to show us our spiritual dimension, that we're God's. He wants us to join the Trinitarian union. Yeah. And the other thing is an insight of Joseph Ratzinger, and actually this, he became Benedict XVI. Mm-hmm. But the book that got him recognized by Paul VI was his Introduction to Christianity, which is far from an introduction. You have to have a doctorate to understand it. But anyway, he makes an amazing psychological insight. He says, from psychology, you are more yourself when you're with the other. This is what love is. That's why we need love in our lives, because that's how we come to ourselves, and we ward off isolation and loneliness and boredom. So he says, what sin does to us is it makes us incapable of being totally with the other. No matter how generous we are and how much we give of ourselves, we'll always hold something back for ourselves. And this prevents us from reaching the fullness of our humanity. Mm-hmm. This is under the subheading of Jesus Christ. He's talking about who Jesus is. But he says Jesus on the cross gave 100% to the Father, to the actual other. Mm-hmm. So psychologically, he's come to himself as the only human being. Mm. He's the only one who's reached the potential that our humanity offers to us. Mm-hmm. So Ratzinger says the Rubicon has been crossed. This is a whole new creation. We're not talking about something that's just another option. So he says the future of humanity hangs on the cross. Yeah. That his disciples, you have to be able to have a certain martyrdom. You have to be able to give 100%. This is why the church has always admired martyrs, because they achieved the fullness of their human nature. And this is, for example, the church just beatified Carlo Akudis, mm-hmm. a 15-year-old who died of leukemia. And when he made his first communion, he went to Mass every day after that. He said, the Eucharist is my highway to heaven. Hmm. He was a computer geek, and he was making a website of Eucharistic miracles. Mm-hmm. And he went to confession regularly. And when he was at 15, suffering with leukemia and dying, he said, I'm offering my sufferings for the welfare of the church. Well, this is giving 100%. So I think this is hugely important. You don't have to be old to be Christian. That he is an example to teenagers.
I'm glad you mentioned him, Father, because one of the questions I had, and Carlos Akudis has been so identified because of the work he was doing on the website with digital media and kind of a saint of new media. You've alluded to a couple of times in conversation the way in which digital media have changed the landscape for young people and what they understand, and even just where they're hanging out and dialoguing and things like that. And the new directory for catechesis talks about that and about how the digital world has become a culture in and of itself, and how those who have grown up in that digital world, it refers to as digital natives, and those of us who saw that digital world grow up around us and now are navigating, doing things like we're doing today in this virtual conversation. We're the digital immigrants, and the directory kind of encourages us to reflect on how might we as digital immigrants have something to offer those digital natives that they may not be aware of, having grown up with that culture around them. And then also, what can we learn from digital natives? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's another huge topic. But anyway, in my book, I have a subheading, technology over language. Mm-hmm. And I don't really go into it too much, because in those days, it wasn't as bad as it is now. But I see it as part and parcel of what we've been talking about in terms of education and the godlessness. It becomes another media avenue to teenagers, and it becomes the way of being. Like, just to own and to use technology is become the shibboleth, the modern password that admits you into society. So I noticed the directory of catechesis. I didn't read it, but I've seen it. But catechesis means to re-echo the tradition, catechesis. So, but St. John Paul, in Catechesi Tradendae, number 20, he says that catechesis follows upon evangelization. And he defined evangelization as having a personal relationship with Jesus. And this is what Carlo Akudis had. Mm-hmm. This is what he told his friends. Jesus is my friend. If you don't befriend him. So this is why I think catechesis fails, because we're trying to catechize unevangelized persons.
Mhm.
So we're left with legalism. We're left with trying to explain what like all of the teachings of the church are easily acceptable if you love God. Sainthood is based on love of God.
Yeah.
When Carlo Acutis at 15, he had no intellectual stuff about the dogmas of the church and none of that stuff. But he is the doctor of the church in that he loved much. And this is, Saint Teresa of Lisieux and Saint Teresa of Calcutta said the same thing. It's the love that goes into something. So how do we get them to love God? And that's where I think my theory comes in, because it starts with the human. If you never become a human being, you'll never love anyone. You won't love yourself, you won't love God, and like the three directions of our world, in, out, and up. And so technology I see as just another. In my final speech, I gave a speech at the graduation on primary retirement, and I said, at one time a pencil case held pencils and maybe cheat sheets and erasers, but now it can hold the World Wide Web. You can download anything. Neil Postman, who's a philosophy of technology, he said that, every technology changes the whole culture.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, with universal reading, there's no childhood anymore. So we're rushing our young people are being pushed out of childhood as children. They're not afforded the opportunity to be young anymore. Mm. And this is a huge tragedy, I think.
Yeah.
So the human sciences, I think, with technology are good, but you asked about people, how they think and learn and grow and behave. Well, this is Bernard Lonergan's general empirical method. Mm-hmm. Lonergan, he spent 25 years teaching in Rome, and he realized that his lectures were useless because the cognitive model had changed. The young people he was talking to were no longer in the scholastic or Thomistic mindset. Mm-hmm. We have to give St. Thomas Aquinas a break, because since he wrote in the 1200s, we've had the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. So he addressed the questions of his day. So Lonergan is doing basically what Plato did. Plato wrote his dialogues to rescue Greek society that was going down the tubes, the civilization. And Lonergan sees us going the same way. That the West is sinking, and we don't. And usually, what comes after it is murder, mass murder, and terrible chaos. So Lonergan, in his cognitive model that he gives us, the interior life, we used to call it the soul, he shows us how we operate. And I taught this to my young people, my students, how we think, what thinking is, how you move from this world to God. And that's your job. That's what your existence is all about. Mm-hmm. So this, I think Lonergan would be great to know. Mm-hmm. And J.K. Chesterton would be great to know, because Chesterton, he was a complete thinker. Yeah. And he saw that what we're doing today is we're not able to see the whole thing. We think in compartments, and we delete what we don't like. And so he foretold the Second World War, and he foretold not only abortion, but infanticide, like 100,000 abortions a day globally. So our young people are caught, as in Heidegger's hermeneutical circle, they're thrown into this world. Mm-hmm. And we have to be real with them about this world. And they respect that. They respect youth ministers who their head is in the clouds, that they realize where we're at. But Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, as the author of Hebrews said. So he's never out of date. But if we don't return to him, and that's what education needs to do, it needs to return to Jesus. And because he is the answer. If we don't, we're in big trouble. We're already in big trouble.
Absolutely. Yeah. This has been just fascinating, Father, and I thank you for joining me in this conversation. I have one last question, and it doesn't have. I know that this could be a whole other hour, but just in 100 words or less, what advice would you give to a new youth minister who's just getting started in ministry? If they said, "Father John, you have so much experience in this area, what's the first thing that I should do, or the most important thing I should do?"
Be evangelized yourself.
Mm.
Someone said, you can't give what you don't have. That was Thomas Aquinas.
Mm-hmm.
So holiness, Bishop Sheen used to say this, that holiness is the only argument we have. So programs, I've never seen a bad program, but the best program on the planet is no good if the persons you're talking to don't love God. And if you yourself don't love God, they can see teenagers different from children. Children see every teacher as wonderful. Teenagers are interested in and have the ability to see the inner life of persons. They have that. That's social perspective taking from Fowler.
Mm-hmm.
They can see that, and they can also, that's why they're so sensitive of whether they're accepted or not, because they can see if you're projecting on them something. Yeah. They're quite wise. You can't fool them.
They're good at spotting hypocrisy, aren't they?
Exactly, precisely.
Yeah.
So I would say that's the first thing. And then read my book. I wish I had my book when I started, because I'm only just beginning to understand what I should have been doing.
Well, thank you so much, and I hope our listeners will go out and get your book. And thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today. This has just been wonderful, and I know it'll be lots of help to lots of folks in ministry. Thank you, Father.
Thank you for the invitation. Bye-bye.